New Zealand is a country that is very reliant on agriculture. It's its main industry. It's also a very unusual country in that we export over 90% of the food we produce. So for a social scientist coming through the system in New Zealand, agriculture and the situation of rural society was always a fairly compelling set of issues. And so, yeah, I was lucky during my PhD. I had the opportunity to study some interesting dynamics around the liberalisation of the New Zealand economy and the kinds of crises that were happening to farm families at the time. Well, most people, most scholars internationally are interested in New Zealand because of the period of neoliberalisation that took place in the 1980s. So New Zealand was the first country, and in some respects the only OECD country, to fully liberalise agriculture, removed all the subsidies and all the government supports, and precipitated a trigger towards market-led agricultural development. So a lot of people have been interested in what happened in New Zealand after that. We certainly had a major crisis, an economic crisis for farm households for the years that followed. This was matched by a wider crisis around the world after 1987. And then through the 1990s, we sort of proceeded through a period of rebuilding New Zealand agriculture, and some new products and styles of things began to emerge and become much more important. Well, we're in a situation in New Zealand where, because the government doesn't play a particularly active role in agriculture, different sectors have gone in different directions. So we have our major pastoral sector with our sheep, beef and dairy farming, they've all gone in different directions. We've had the emergence of a large horticultural exporter, the kiwi fruit industry. It's going in a very specific direction. And then we've got our reasonably well-known wine industry, which has also been going through a lot of growth over the last 20 years. And they all seem to be taking their own pathway towards integrating with global markets. The wine and kiwi fruit sectors are very strongly oriented towards quality and environmental standards, and they're aiming for sort of the top of the market. Our dairy industry is somewhat at the other end of the strategy spectrum. They've been pushing towards a massive intensification and expansion of the land area under dairy production, and have been looking to increase the volume of dairy products. And that has brought us to a point over the last 5 to 8 years where we are now really starting to experience the environmental limits of that strategy. Yes, well, the link between food and environment is an incredibly important one, and I think what got lost in the 1980s with the liberalisation of agriculture, with sort of you unleash a whole lot of economic forces, and then you evaluate their success entirely in economic terms. So the narrative of what happened in New Zealand after liberalisation is very much which sectors shrank, which sectors grew, what was the level of productivity that was happening, what new products got developed, what new things were going to market. But what was really being missed in that is that rapidly expanding sectors like dairying were really starting to take up all the available environmental capacity that New Zealand has had as an agricultural producer. So the neoliberal thing started with a disconnection between food production and the environment, and increasingly we've gone through a series of phases where it's become increasingly difficult to deny that massively intensifying food production comes at an environmental cost. It just takes a while for the cost to be paid. Well, I think the thing that you see with New Zealand also, as well as the neoliberalisation of agriculture, is that New Zealand is a very interesting country in terms of free trade, which is linked but a slightly different area of politics. So from the 1980s, while New Zealand was liberalising its own economy, it became a very leading advocate of trade liberalisation. So New Zealand was a leading member of what was called the Cairns group of free trading countries that joined together at the WTO, particularly through the GATT Uruguay round from 85 to 95, and really pushed for the first time for agriculture to be liberalised as a global industry. And New Zealand was at the forefront of saying agriculture will be better off if we engage in global free trade negotiations. We'll reduce tariff barriers, food will get cheaper, it'll be easier for people to invest in agriculture, there'll be more abundant food, there'll be cheaper food, everyone will be better off. And so there was great optimism amongst a lot of agricultural policy folk and economists that in 1995, with the creation of the World Trade Organization, New Zealand was the kind of country that was demonstrating what the rest of the world was going to become like. So we were the free trading, unsubsidized agricultural exporter. And since 1995, really everyone's expectations haven't really been met. We've been rather confounded by what's happened since 1995, because since then there has not been one single global scale free trade agreement signed involving agriculture. So the 1995 one was the first, and in many cases it may be the only one. And that idea that the world would get together and engage in large global scale free trade agreements is really starting to lose a lot of political credibility. So the WTO has basically failed to conclude any meaningful negotiation at a global scale for over 20 years now. And people really ask questions about the future of that organisation as a global entity. And then there was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that got right to the point of being signed off, and then the Trump presidency has pulled the plug on that. And the rest of the countries in the TPPA are trying to see if they can revive it, but really there's serious questions as to whether TPPA really represents an opportunity for a major liberalisation for agriculture. So something's happened that New Zealand is at the forefront of, which sort of suggests that we went into this big phase of trade liberalisation in agriculture, and now we're wondering, is it really where things are going? And in that respect, I think New Zealand tells us something slightly different. And that is that in 2008, New Zealand signed a big agreement with China. And that had a massive impact on New Zealand's agricultural economy, particularly dairy farming, and drove a lot of intensification and increases in the land area and dairying after 2008. And the nature of the China agreement between New Zealand and China is written in the language of a free trade agreement, but in many respects it's much more targeted and focused than that. It's actually an agricultural supply agreement. It's about how China's going to feed itself in the next 50 years, and it's about New Zealand's role as an exclusive supplier of export products to feed the Chinese middle classes. And in that regard, the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement may actually be signalling something very different to free trade. It may be signalling the emergence of food security as a national concern for places like China, as the predominant driver now of global trade discussions around agriculture. That China is actually trying to lock up a series of cooperating countries that will become China's food supply. And the idea that New Zealand simply sells food into a global market is becoming less plausible. I mean, this seems to be where the future is now heading, is that food security has become an actually compelling concern since 2008, and countries like China are really trying to lock up a stable food supply. Well, I think New Zealand, when thought of as a social science question, poses the great dilemma for food and agriculture studies that's existed really since the Industrial Revolution, which is that we've ended up through the 1800s with a world in which the production of food and the consumption of food happen in very different places, generally. And right through the 20th century, we just expanded the scope of the global food system so that countries like New Zealand end up being exclusive food exporters. And the people who eat New Zealand food products are a long way away from the farmers or the orchardists that produce the products. And for social scientists, that's a particularly peculiar problem. It's a massive separation between food production and food consumption. It's a separation of agriculture and food. And one of the great stories of the recent decades in the world has been the politics around actually how do you reconnect food? How do you put food back closer to where it's being produced physically? How do you put food back closer to where it's being produced socially and culturally? And so globally you see a whole lot of things like the slow food movement in Italy and all sorts of other things, the rise of the local food movement, the rise of farmers markets, the rise of geographical indicators. And New Zealand has really struggled to know exactly how to do that because our food is consumed so far away from where we produce it. And we have a few industries that are really trying very hard to sort of re-establish or to reconnect between consumers and producers of food, and probably particularly our wine industry has been very successful at this. New Zealand's Pinot Noir exports are now known throughout the world. Our exports of Sauvignon Blanc, we know that Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand comes from a particular province, Marlborough. It's very well known. But the point about that is that it's very successful, but it's also the exception. So in places like New Zealand, we are really still struggling in a highly neoliberalised agricultural economy to reconnect food back to where, to reconnect the gap between food production and food consumption.